Commander Ethan Rhodes slumped in his high-tech command chair, his tired eyes scanning the digital map on his terminal. His hands, calloused from years of military service, gripped a mug filled with cold coffee half empty, like the rest of his morning. Outside the window, the dusty expanse of Fiers stretched endlessly, a red desert under a violet sky. It was eerily quiet, and something about the planet had always felt off. But then, everything had been off ever since the humans arrived. "Commander Rhodes," came the clipped, mechanical voice from the intercom, urgent communication from the front lines. Rhodes muttered a curse under his breath. Another damn emergency. Just what he needed today. He raised an eyebrow. "What's the crisis this time, Sergeant?" The hologram flickered to life in front of him, showing Sergeant Hale, one of his most reliable officers. But today, Hale didn't look so reliable. The young man's face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. Behind him, the harsh static of battlefield radio crackled. "Sir, we've encountered something. The soil, it's moving. The sand, it's alive. We need backup, now." Rhodes leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Alive? He wasn't sure if Hale was losing his mind or if this was some kind of sick joke. Then came the strangest part of the message. As if Hale's words weren't bizarre enough, a deep, almost otherworldly voice cut through the transmission. It was unmistakable, resonating with a power that made Rhodes's hairs stand on end. "Humans. Your time is over." The hologram flickered and distorted, the words lingering in the air like a curse, before the feed cut out entirely. For a moment, Rhodes sat in stunned silence, the only sound the soft hum of the command center. "Well, that's one way to start the day," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. His mind, though still groggy from sleep, began to piece together the pieces. The Kfor, the name echoed in his mind. He had heard of them before, in scattered reports that had been dismissed as outlandish. Ancient, extraterrestrial life buried beneath Fiers' surface. Species lost to time. But surely it couldn't be true. Could it? The humans had been on Fiers for years, and until now, the only things they'd encountered were desolate rock, mineral-rich sands, and some underground resources. Nothing alive. Nothing sentient. Rhodes shook his head, trying to focus. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and left the command center in a hurry. His first instinct was to gather his team and head out to investigate. He'd been in enough skirmishes to know that the first report was rarely the full story. The air outside the command base was thick with the dry dust of Fiers' desert landscape. The wind howled, carrying with it an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of metal from the base's outer walls. Rhodes squinted into the harsh light, adjusting his tactical visor. Beside him, Dr. Maria Chen, an astrobiologist with a passion for ecological preservation, was already preparing her field equipment. She had a narrow face, sharp eyes that often looked over her glasses like she could see right through the world. But today, she looked more concerned than usual. "Did you hear the transmission, Commander?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with an edge of urgency. "It's not just a malfunction. That wasn't just a weird noise. I've been analyzing the soil for months, and I think it's connected. There's something beneath the surface here, something we didn't expect." Rhodes nodded, but his mind was racing. The military had been keeping close tabs on the mineral reserves of Fiers for years now. They'd been building a colony, setting up mining operations, sending down drills and rigs, assuming the planet was just another resource-rich desert world. But what if that assumption had been wrong? "What do you mean connected?" he asked, pushing the thoughts from his head for the moment. The situation at hand was more pressing. I think the planet itself is alive, Commander. Not in the way we think of living organisms, but connected, aware. It could be a collective mind, or an ecological system far more advanced than anything we've encountered before." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Rhodes didn't respond at first. He just watched her for a moment, considering the implications of what she was saying. Alive. A collective mind. If she was right, this wasn't just about defending a colony. This was a much bigger problem. Well, he said, finally breaking the silence, let's hope we're not about to piss off the locals. They climbed into a transport vehicle, and within minutes, they were racing across the desert, heading toward the location of the disturbance. It didn't take long before they found the first signs of something strange. The ground around the mining base was cracked, as though something had shifted underneath it. Massive fissures lined the surface, and the soil was an unnerving shade of brownish red. In the distance, Rhodes could see a few figures from the scouting party. They stood frozen in place, as if entranced, staring at something in the distance. "Sergeant Hale," Rhodes called over the comms, "report." There was a long pause before Hale's voice crackled through, laced with both awe and fear. "Sir, you need to see this for yourself. The ground, it's shifting. Something's coming up from beneath." Rhodes and Dr. Chen exchanged a glance before they sped up, the transport kicking up dust behind them. The closer they got, the stranger the scene became. The sand around the figures was moving, writhing like an endless sea of worms. It was as if the planet itself had come to life. By the time they reached the scouting party, the ground had shifted dramatically. A massive, almost towering plant-like structure had erupted from the soil, its tendrils reaching up toward the sky. It pulsed with a strange energy, shimmering with an iridescent glow. The air felt heavier, saturated with an unfamiliar hum, and Rhodes instinctively reached for his weapon, his pulse quickening. "Is this what you meant?" Rhodes asked Dr. Chen, his voice strained. Doctor Chen didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched, as if drawn toward the structure. "I think this is just the beginning." Before they could react, the ground beneath them vibrated again. From the sand, dozens more plant-like tendrils shot up, wrapping around rocks, extending upward in a sudden, violent explosion of life. And then they heard it, the voice. Deep, resonating, and unmistakably alien. "Humans. Your time is over." The words were not just heard, but felt, reverberating through the ground, in their bones, in their very minds. A wave of nausea swept through Rhodes. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, like the planet itself was trying to communicate with them, and it wasn't happy. Rhodes turned to Dr. Chen, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We need to get back," he said urgently. But it was too late. The ground split beneath them with a deafening roar. The air was filled with the sound of snapping roots and the violent shifting of the planet's surface. Before they could even react, a massive root burst from the earth, coiling around them. "Get back!" Rhodes shouted, pulling his weapon and firing at the tendrils, but they seemed impervious to his shots, like the very earth itself had hardened against them. Dr. Chen's voice trembled. It's too late. We've awakened them." Rhodes's heart hammered in his chest as the tendrils of the alien plant wrapped tighter around them, the earth shaking with each powerful movement. The roots, thick as tree trunks, seemed alive, twisting, pulsing, as if the very planet was breathing. He could feel the pressure of the ground beneath him, the sand becoming soft and spongy as it swelled, a strange energy radiating from the core of Fiers. He gritted his teeth, his pulse quickening. "Move, Dr. Chen," he barked, but the words barely escaped his mouth before the root squeezed tighter. It was no use. The plant, whatever it was, seemed to be everywhere at once, an unrelenting force, a living, breathing entity that surrounded them. "Commander, we're not going to make it." Hale's voice crackled over the comms, but Rhodes barely heard him. He was focused on the cold, creeping sensation tightening around his body. He reached for his sidearm, his fingers numb, and fired blindly at the nearest tendril, but the shots had no effect. The roots continued their relentless assault, tightening around their group like the fingers of a giant hand. Dr. Chen, however, had already sprung into action. She moved quickly, her mind racing with every possibility, every theory she had ever considered about this planet. Her eyes were fixed on the plant in front of them, studying it like a scientist trying to understand a new species, even in the middle of the battle. "We need to communicate," she shouted, her voice filled with panic but also determination. "The Kfor aren't just a species, they're a collective. They can't be destroyed like this. They think we're a threat, but we're not." Rhodes had no idea what she was talking about. All he could feel was the crushing pressure, the sense that everything around him was closing in. He had always been a soldier, trained to fight, to respond to threats with force. But this was something different. This was no enemy he could shoot or bomb into submission. This was the land itself, fighting back against their presence. The root tightened again, and Rhodes gasped, struggling for breath as the plant began to pull him into the earth. His vision blurred, the world turning red as the ground swallowed him, but even as his body was being dragged downward, his mind raced with the realization that this was no ordinary assault. The Kfor weren't just fighting to defend their territory. They were fighting for survival. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the air, something that wasn't natural. It was like the shriek of metal on metal, a shrill, high-pitched noise that reverberated through the planet itself. The roots stopped their relentless tightening. For a split second, everything froze. What was that? Dr. Chen whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. Rhodes didn't know. All he could do was stare at the sky as the sound faded into nothingness, a momentary break in the chaos. The pressure on his body loosened, and the roots that had been tightening around them seemed to retract slightly, as though waiting for something. "It's not over," Rhodes muttered through gritted teeth, as he tried to steady himself against the shifting terrain. He could hear the distant hum again, low and resonant, vibrating through the sand. Whatever the Kfor were, they weren't giving up. They were making sure humanity understood just how dangerous their presence was. A sudden crackling sound broke the silence, and a new figure appeared from behind a ridge. It was Sergeant Hale, covered in dirt and sweat, his face pale but determined. He had a strange device in his hands, something they hadn't used in months, a communications unit designed to tap into deep space signals. Hale ran toward them, his eyes fixed on the plant's massive roots as they began to stir once more. "We've got a problem," Hale said breathlessly, holding up the device. "This is a communication signal. It's coming from underground. It's not just the planet, they are sending messages." Rhodes blinked, confusion setting in. "Messages? Who the hell are we talking to here, Hale?" Hale pressed a few buttons on the device, and the hum intensified. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with it, as though the very planet was responding to the signal. Dr. Chen was staring at it now, her mouth agape. "This isn't a communication, it's a warning. The Kfor are trying to tell us something. We've been trying to understand them wrong this whole time. They're not just an alien species, they are the planet. The ecosystem. The soil, the plants, the air, everything is part of their collective mind." Rhodes's thoughts churned, the pieces slowly falling into place. The Kfor weren't invaders. They weren't like the enemies he had faced in the past. They were more than just a hostile force. They were a living, breathing world that had evolved to defend itself, to protect its delicate balance. "And we're the ones who've been the invaders," Rhodes muttered. "Shit. We didn't know," Dr. Chen said quietly, her voice filled with a strange sense of sorrow. "No one knew. But now, we have to make a choice. We have to stop trying to destroy them, or they'll destroy us." The device crackled again, this time louder. A new voice, alien, deep, and almost melodic, filtered through the static. "Humans. You have trespassed. Your greed has poisoned the land. It is not your right to claim what you do not understand. Leave, or perish." The voice sent a chill through Rhodes's spine. It wasn't just a warning, it was a statement of intent. The Kfor were not bluffing. They could, and would, eradicate the human presence from Fiers if they didn't leave. What do we do now, Rhodes? Hale asked, his voice shaking. Rhodes looked at the device in Hale's hands, then at Dr. Chen, who seemed deep in thought. He couldn't let his men die here. He couldn't let the colony be destroyed. But what if the cost of survival was greater than the cost of fighting back? We need to make contact with them, Rhodes said finally. We can't fight them, not like this. We have to find another way. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and hope. I'll need to get closer to their center. We need to establish communication with their collective mind, somehow. They won't listen unless they understand that we're not here to destroy them. We'll give you cover, Rhodes said, his voice steady, despite the chaos around them. But make it quick, Doctor. The sound of shifting earth reverberated through the air again, and Rhodes felt the ground tremble beneath him. The Kfor were close, closer than they had ever been. This was no longer about fighting to survive. This was about trying to coexist, or failing that, finding a way to end this war before it consumed them all. Commander, Hale said urgently, we don't have much time. They're preparing for something bigger. Rhodes gave a sharp nod. The stakes had never been higher. The war for Fiers had begun, but it wasn't a war of weapons and firepower. It was a war of understanding, of survival, and perhaps of a fragile hope that both sides could learn to share the planet before it was too late. Dr. Chen took a deep breath and stepped forward, into the thickening air, into the heart of the planet, the heart of the Kfor. The ground around her hummed, vibrating with the strange, alien energy that pulsed beneath Fiers' surface. She didn't know what would happen next. But it was the only chance they had. Stay safe, Rhodes called after her. His voice, once filled with certainty, now sounded uncertain. A glimmer of hope and fear flickered in his chest, and as Dr. Chen moved forward, a distant, unsettling sound filled the air. A final warning, or perhaps a prelude to something even worse. The hum of the planet, the pulse of its life, grew louder. Rhodes steeled himself for what was to come. He had made his choice, now, they would have to make theirs. Dr. Chen moved forward, the weight of her mission pressing down on her chest. The air around her thickened, the ground beneath her feet vibrating with the low hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of Fiers. The sound was almost musical in its intensity, but there was nothing comforting about it. It was alien in a way that made her skin crawl, as though it were alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful. She glanced back over her shoulder at Rhodes and Hale, who stood together, their silhouettes framed by the dusty red horizon. Hale's expression was tight with anxiety, his hand gripping his weapon like it might somehow help against what was coming. Rhodes, always the soldier, appeared calm on the surface, but his eyes betrayed the doubt gnawing at him. His gaze never wavered from her, as if willing her to succeed. Be careful, Rhodes called to her, though his voice was barely audible over the rising hum of the planet. Dr. Chen didn't respond, only nodded, her heart beating in sync with the pulsing earth. She had spent years studying this world, researching its ecology, its history, everything that made Fiers unique, but nothing had prepared her for this. There were no studies in her textbooks, no simulations that could have predicted an intelligent, living planet so intricately connected to its inhabitants. The Kfor were not just an alien species, they were the planet itself, an intricate web of life that formed a single, sentient entity. As she walked toward the heart of the disturbance, the ground around her began to shift more violently. The air felt dense, as though the atmosphere itself was growing thicker, pressing in on her. The hum intensified, rising in pitch, until it almost felt like it was vibrating inside her skull. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The Kfor had warned them. They had no more time. Yet Dr. Chen knew there had to be a way to bridge the gap between humanity and the planet. They had to show the Kfor they were not invaders, they were just trying to survive. The closer she got to the center of the disturbance, the stronger the pull. She could feel it now, a faint tugging sensation, almost like the planet was trying to guide her, or maybe it was testing her, challenging her to prove she was worthy of entering its heart. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with purpose, as though it knew she was coming. She arrived at the epicenter, an immense chasm that had opened up in the earth. The edges of the canyon were jagged, the rocks surrounding it coated in a thick, vine-like growth that pulsed with an unnatural energy. This was at the nexus of the Kvor's collective consciousness. Dr. Chen knelt at the edge of the chasm, gazing down into the depths below. It was impossible to see the bottom, the darkness stretching into infinity, but the strange, glowing tendrils that had shot up from the earth were now converging here, swirling and writhing in a chaotic dance. The very air was alive with energy, thick with the buzzing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Can you hear me?" Dr. Chen whispered, the words leaving her lips before she had time to think. She wasn't sure what she expected. A response, perhaps, but not in the traditional sense. The Kvor didn't communicate with words. They didn't need to. Their collective consciousness reached far beyond the limits of language, and then, as if on cue, a wave of energy washed over her. It wasn't physical, but it was overwhelming, a flood of thoughts and emotions that crashed into her mind. She staggered back, her heart racing, as a voice echoed in her skull, deep, resonant, not spoken aloud, but felt, heard in the very marrow of her bones. "Human," the voice rumbled, its tone impossibly ancient, layered with centuries of wisdom and power. "You trespass where you should not. You disturb what should remain undisturbed. Why do you come?" Dr. Chen took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had prepared for this moment her whole life, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the raw, unfathomable presence of the Kvor. She could feel their thoughts swirling around her, an unfathomable web of consciousness reaching out to her, testing her, waiting for her to speak. "We didn't mean to disturb you," Dr. Chen said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We didn't understand. But we're not here to hurt you. We're here to learn. To understand. We're not invaders, we're survivors. Just like you." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The hum of the planet persisted, its energy swirling around her like an unseen current. The tendrils in the chasm began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if the Kvor were contemplating her words. "You come," the voice responded at last, "to take what is not yours. To bend the world to your will, to strip it of what you cannot see. Your kind spreads like a disease, claiming what you do not understand." The word stung, and Dr. Chen felt a surge of guilt and anger rise up within her. But she couldn't falter. "Not now. I understand," she said, her voice steady. "I see the damage we've done. We didn't know. But now we do. Please, let us help. We can work together. We can find a way to coexist." The response was immediate, a burst of energy that overwhelmed her senses, a shockwave of thought that rattled her to her core. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The planet's pulse surged around her, pressing in on her, testing her resolve. "You come too late," the voice said. "Your kind has poisoned the land. You take and take, leaving nothing behind. You are a plague, and we are the cure." The ground trembled beneath her feet as the tendrils began to rise higher, their movements growing more frantic. The Kvor were angry. They had decided. "No," Dr. Chen said, her voice louder now, her fear giving way to determination. "We can't undo the past, but we can change the future. Please, let me help you understand. We can protect this world together. We can learn to share it." The hum of the planet grew deafening, a wave of sound that seemed to vibrate through her very soul. It was as if the planet itself was screaming, protesting, fighting against the very idea of coexistence, but then, something shifted. A new presence, softer, calmer, entered the fold. The chaotic energy of the Kvor's collective mind seemed to steady, and the voice of the planet softened, though it was still laced with pain. "Can you truly understand?" the voice asked, its tone no longer threatening but curious. Can you change the nature of your kind? Can you teach them to stop? Dr. Chen took a slow, measured breath. We can try. We must. There was a long silence. Then, the tendrils began to retract, slowly, cautiously, as if the Kfor were weighing her words. The hum in the air softened, turning from an overwhelming crescendo to a low, mournful thrum. The voice spoke again, this time with less hostility. You may try. But know this, if your kind fails, if you bring destruction to this world, there will be no mercy. Dr. Chen nodded, her heart pounding. I understand. I won't let that happen. The chasm before her was still, the strange energy in the air beginning to dissipate. She felt the weight of the planet's collective gaze on her, and for the first time, she truly understood. The Kfor were not mindless monsters. They were guardians, protectors of a world that had been thrown into chaos by human greed, but maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Rhodes and Hale were watching from a distance, both of them tense, their weapons at the ready. They knew better than to get too close. The planet, the Kfor, were unpredictable, and Dr. Chen's success or failure would determine everything. For now, they could only wait and hope the end.